More than halfway through class, and today we're looking at Chapter 10, Becoming a Young Adult. This chapter looks at a very specific period of time, and this time at the end of adolescence and probably up to about 30 years of age. We call this emerging adulthood. And the primary reason we call it emerging adulthood is that while you've had a lot of experiences as a child, you're just beginning to develop your experiences as an adult. And we also know your brain is still changing at this time. So we're sort of experiencing a lot of things, but we're not fully feeling like an adult. Now, you ask a 22-year-old and they're going to say, of course I'm adult. But for most of us, once we get a little bit older, we realize we weren't quite there as a full adult yet. But we also have to understand that different markers are used to sort of establish when adulthood happens, depending on the culture they're in. What most of us are in at this time is what we say this role transition period, where those new responsibilities and duties begin to take on meanings that we haven't had before. We may have imagined marriage before, but now quite often people are getting married in their 20s. We may have imagined having a child before, but many people are having children in their late 20s, or you're starting careers. You're buying houses, you're setting up things. So it's sort of this beginning of this time period. It's a time period for us to learn what it is to really be an adult on our own. Your book goes on to talk a little bit about something called rite of passages. Now, a rite of passage is a phenomena or ritual of some sort in which you start in one position, but by the end of the ritual, you're in a new position. It doesn't have to be about adulthood. Quite often, rite of passages are about adulthood. So, what is it in your own household? For Western culture, for most of us, sort of that entrance into adulthood is the end of high school. Before high school, we think of you as a child, a child, a child. Even an 18-year-old who's still in high school is still kind of considered to be a child. But we hit that graduation date, and boy, boom, we're suddenly an adult, you might want to say. But you also have to understand that rites of passages are more than just a mark into adulthood. A rite of passage can also just simply mark a change from one to another. So there are lots of different things that we may see. So this little picture that you see down here at the bottom is a rite of passage of people entering into a sorority club. A more common rite of passage is marriage. Now, I always ask people, what is the purpose of marriage? And many people will say, oh, it's, to be unionized with somebody else. But if that's what the purpose was, why would we have all these people here? Why is it such a big deal that the entire society comes out? And what it really is saying is that these two people have made a commitment to themselves, but it's also to allow the rest of the society to understand that at this time, these two people's statuses have changed. That before the marriage, they were single and available, and you had the right to date them. But after this marriage ceremony, after this ritual, they are no longer available to the community. They are no longer available for potential mates. That's why the entire society used to come out for these. Some rites of passages might be one going into adulthood, or the right to basically bear children, or a religious rite. And we can see different cultures have different ones. One of the ones that many of you know about is a bar mitzvah. And a bar mitzvah was a passage time for a young boy in a Jewish religion to show that he had become a man. So these rites of passages are pretty much with us. Now, what's also interesting about rites of passages is that many families have their own rites of passages. There may be something in your own household that is a tradition from one generation to another. Maybe when you hit double digits, you get to do something. Or when you hit 16, you get to drive a car. It's sort of a rite of passage. You get this other car. Each household and each community quite often develops their own rites of passages. And basically, all it's saying is that the moment before this ritual happened, you were considered one thing. And the moment after the ritual, you're considered something else. So a graduation is always a good one, a college graduation, because many of you who want to go on to be nurses, just before that graduation, you weren't really a nurse. And you walk across that stage, they say, hey, you're now a graduate, and all of a sudden you're a nurse. Did you learn any more material in the last 10 minutes? The answer is no. You knew just as much as you knew 10 minutes before, but now the whole community who is there to watch you now all agree. We have seen that you have finished. We have seen this rite of passage. You've walked across the stage. You have been confirmed your degree. We now all agree you know everything that you probably need to know to start out as a nurse. Because we are a little on the younger side here, we are still in what we call edge work. Basically, what we're talking about is that we will push ourselves, whether it's financially, physically, mentally. This is the time we feel that we have the ability and the time and the effort to make these more risky decisions. So we find that people will tend to be risky with their money and they may be risky with their lives. I'm one of these people who feels there's no reason to jump out of a perfectly good flying airplane and fall like a big rock through the sky, but some people enjoy enjoy that, and that's kind of risky behavior. You may find people who start to backpack across the country by themselves. Basically, what it is that at this point we feel like we have those abilities. We're physically strong or mentally strong. We may not be financially strong, but we may feel like we have the ability to get around the financial thing because we've got lots of time. Unlike a person who's getting older who may feel like they don't have time to earn that money. So they'll be less risky with their money. Erickson says the big thing right here is intimacy versus isolation. Now, in the one just before this, it was about understanding who we were. And one of the things that Erickson points out is that if we don't understand our identity, if we haven't figured out our identity, then there's a good chance that we're not going to be able to connect with another person. Now, romantic connections are the ones that we tend to think about most often, but we also have to understand that if we don't understand who we are, we quite often can't connect with other people, even into a friendship. So we need to have a strong sense of identity. Those adolescent years are very important to help us develop that sense of identity so that we now know who we are so that we can now connect with other people who fulfill needs within our lives, whether it's a social need, a romantic need, but we aren't going to be able to connect with people if we don't know who we are. Or maybe you've met somebody who, when they hit their 30s, kind of goes, I don't know why I'm like this. And quite often they'll break away from all the friends that they've thought that they've made because they don't connect with them because they didn't really know who they were. So this is sort of a critical thing. If we don't have our identity, we're probably not going to be able to develop intimacy. Physically, you're pretty much at your peak. We both peak somewhere in our late 20s, early 30s. But the thing I always highlight here is that we do have some declines. We tend to think everything is going up, but it's not true. Our hearing actually begins to decline in our late 20s. What we begin not to be able to do is hear high-pitched tones. Now, some of you may say, well, the eyes. Well, if you had bad eyes, you probably had them in childhood. And those who had already wearing glasses in childhood would, of course, continue to wear their glasses in their 20s. But people who didn't wear glasses in their childhood quite often are not picking up glasses in their 20s. They will a little bit later in their 30s and maybe 40s. But it's this high-pitched hearing. By the time you're 20 or 21, you begin to lose some of those tones that the 8-year-olds had. In fact, 15-year-olds can't even hear as well as an 8-year-old hears. So I always say that if there's a little kid who says there's a high-pitched whine and it's really bothering them and you don't hear it, they're not lying. You just can't hear it, even if you're 21. I always love to ask this to people. I always say, what is BMI? A majority of my classes will say body mass index. Yes, BMI stands for body mass index, but don't get thrown by this. At this point, you know enough about the world, I guess you might want to say, and healthcare and other things, that when an instructor is asking you what something like BMI is, they're not asking you for the abbreviations. They're asking you what is it actually. And so BMI is basically a ratio of body weight related to body height, and it tells us just how fat somebody is and what the risk of their health is depending on their BMI. So if you get a test question for, and me, I won't be giving you any written test questions. But if you get one that says, what is BMI? Trust me, they do not want you just to write body mass index. If they say, what does BMI stand for? Then they do. If you're unsure, go ahead and give them body mass index, but also give them the definition. Make sure you say the ratio of body weight to height. You're at that point now where you understand the basic lexicons of certain parts of the language. The other one that we kind of want to make sure you learn as you get out of here is LDLs and HDLs. Now, this is sort of how I remember them. I always think of LDLs as losers, the L to go with L in losing, to go with low density. Whereas I always think of HDLs as helpers. They're the ones who make you better. They help break down the arteries. So if you kind of want to look at, the L in loser as being the L here and the H in helper is sort of going with the H here, quite often that will help you remember which one we want a lot of and which one we do not want a lot of. So it's pretty simple. You see some information down there of what the standard is. For me, what I really want you to do is be able to identify which one is the good one and which one is the one we don't want. When it comes to the brain, what we really see is kind of this transformation into more of a mature brain. And this is a pretty cool picture down here that you're looking at. You can see that the yellow and the reds in the 5-year-old brain, that's a less mature brain. And that by the time you're 20, you've got a pretty mature brain. What we're talking about here is kind of an interesting phase that goes on between the preteen and the 20-year-old, is that at this point, our brain is really becoming its final brain, its final maturity, you might want to say. So we know that as we get older, there are going to be some things that get better and some things that get worse, you might want to say. As you grow up, you may say, hey, I'm really going to be focusing a lot more on math. And so your math brain may kind of develop a little bit more in high school. And as soon as you get out of high school, all that stuff you learned in English may kind of go by the wayside. You're like, yeah, I read 1984 at one point, but I don't really remember the story. Whereas people who may go more into an English degree will find that they hold that material. They remember 1984 and all the other lovely books they read in high school, and they may forget a lot about their geometry. And one day they got to go buy paint, and they're like, oh God, at one point I knew how to figure out the circumference of a circle and how much area and mass and all that kind of stuff I need to know. I don't need it now. Why? Because as our brain grows, it says you're not using it, you're going to lose it. But as a young person, that doesn't happen because as a young person, we don't know yet what our brain is going to need. And so as we mature, our brain will basically begin to slough off, you might want to say, information. But what is interesting is that the brain has this thing called plasticity. So underneath the right conditions, our brain can modify itself. Meaning is that even into our late adulthood, as we are growing into seniors, our brain can still learn new things. I mean, if you think about it, somebody who loses their left arm, that part of the brain doesn't die. That part of the brain gets taken over by other aspects of the brain that helps them learn how to basically survive or move other elements. Our brain constantly is adapting and modifying as it goes. It's one of the reasons why we say for you to have a healthy brain is really to keep learning even into your adulthood. So right now, many of you are adults, but we're talking about into your 50s and your 60s. As people continue to adapt and learn new things, then we find that their brain plasticity is better and their brain activity is better. With this, then, the two types of intelligence I really want you to come out of this chapter understanding is fluid and crystal intelligence. Now, fluid intelligence right here, this is sort of our first one. You might think of it as our ability to bring in new information and adapt to that new information. So the older we get, the harder it's going to be for us to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't want to. It basically becomes harder for the brain to do it. Whereas our crystal intelligence is like our encyclopedia. The older we get, the better our memory gets. So this chart down here is one that I really like because what it kind of shows you is that our crystal intelligence, which is right here, it gets better with time. So here we are with looking at sort of this greenish blue one. And you'll notice that as we get 70, our brain is much better here than it was back when we were in our 20s. And yet, our fluid intelligent, right here, this sort of orange line, unfortunately, you'll notice it goes down. We get our peak right around here in our 30s. And for many of you, that may be playing out for you. Either you're a little older and it's already has, or it is playing out for you. And what's kind of interesting is that a lot of our students who are in their later 20s, early 30s, actually will find our math classes a little bit easier than they were before. And you say, well, how can it be easier now? Well, in part, you have experience. And so you've experienced math in the real world, whereas younger students will not have experienced math in the real world. I mean, at this point, if you want to tell me 20% off of some dress, I can figure 20% off in my head. But probably in my high school days, that was like, oh my God, 20%. I don't know how to figure that out. So we've adjusted to things. But you do notice that that goes down with time. We don't really see a huge drop off. You might say we not see a real big problem with fluid intelligence until we get into our sort of mid to late 70s. And again, some of this just really depends on the development of that individual's brain and a little bit on genetics. If it's a more long living sort of family and they live to be 100, then that drop off may not happen until their 80s. Whereas we have people who may have shorter lives and are basically sort of biologically going to have a shorter life, we may see that drop off a little bit faster. But we don't see huge drop offs for quite a long time. You can see it's kind of a slow kind of decline. In fact, so slow that most of the time we don't really notice it until somewhere in our later 50s, our early 60s. You see people having little hiccups, you might want to say. They call them senior moments, but things aren't working quite as fast and as flexible as they used to. I did mention early on that when we talked about Piaget had four basic elements to his concept of development as far as cognitive is concerned. But I said there was a fifth one. And this fifth one is called post-formal thinking. So, what post formal thinking is at this point you're an adult and you're going to use something different than you may have used before to begin to help you solve things. And the biggest thing you're going to begin to use is basically some problem solving techniques. These problem solving techniques are going to rely a lot on what's called reflective judgment. Now, reflective judgment is basically an ability to reflect on what's happened and make decisions based on those factors that we've seen. So we talk about this sort of pragmatic time period to make decisions. So what's the difference between somebody who's using this and not using this? Well, with the pragmatics, what we're going to look at is perhaps our own relationships, our own um, things that have happened to us and relate them to others. So I kind of like the one you have in your book where it talks about somebody who has plagiarized and they're going to have to stand in front of a college board. Now, a younger person might say, hey, you plagiarized, the rule book says this, and thus you're out of here. You are out. It doesn't matter. We're so sorry, but you plagiarized, and the rule says that if you plagiarize, you're out of the university. Whereas an older student who's in post-formal thinking may say, but why did you plagiarize? You seem to have been a pretty good student. You had pretty good grades. This doesn't seem to quite make sense. And so the person tells their sad tale about how they had gotten into a car accident and their child had to be flown to Arnold Palmer, and they went to Arnold Palmer with the child, and they know they should have just told their teacher that they were having this difficulty, but the truth was is this just seemed easier. They just copied and pasted that and they know they were wrong, but it just the pressure of the moment, they just wanted to get this done and be with their child. So that person may reflect on that and say, well, I have a child and I can understand the pressure of that and wanting to be done with the class, and yeah, I could see where I might fall into that. And they have a note that says that their child was an Arnold Palmer. And so they might say, okay, instead of getting thrown out of the university, you're going to have to fail this class and retake the class. And maybe they have to take a class on plagiarism too. But they've used their reflective judgment to make a decision. Whereas the younger person simply says, here's what the rules are, and sorry, but that's what you did. At toward the end of our book, we have a little section there that we're going to talk a little bit about. And there are a couple of things that begin to happen. Again, we're talking about emerging adulthood, so you've got these things happening. And the first is that lifespan construct, and that's basically the sense of our past and our present and our future. And what's kind of interesting is that when we start talking to people about their lifespan, if you listen to most people, they'll talk about how they were born in this place, and then they were raised in this place, and then they jump to after high school. So they get like 2 seconds of before high school, and then they talk about after high school. That's because we don't tend to think of our life really beginning until we're more independent. And so that lifespan construct, how you tend to talk about your past and also your future is important in this one. So you might say, "Oh, I was born in Indiana, Florida, and I went to school there. I went to the local Catholic school, and then I went to some public schools, and then I went off to UCF and got my degree, and then I blah 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 blah." And you go on and on, and in the future, I'm going to be doing blah 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 blah. And so people, especially who are in their 20s and early 30s, talk a lot more about their future. This also tends to be a time when we set these things called social clocks. Basically, this sort of time we believe something's going to happen. So by the time I'm 30, I'm going to do this. By the time I'm 40, I'm going to do this. And we've tagged some sort of time to some goal that we have. By the time I'm 25, I want to do this. By the time I'm 50, I want to retire and have enough money to retire on. So these are all social clocks, and those are important because they do help us set goals and to begin to work toward those goals. The question comes is what happens if you don't meet those goals? For some people, that can become very depressing, and for other people, they just reset the goal to another time. This is also the time we create these life stories. So, our personal narrative of how things go. Your parents' life story about you may be different than your own life story because in this one, our attitudes, our emotions tend to be put in there. And our life stories will begin in our late adolescence, but notice it says it forms from middle age onward, and they do tend to reshape how we view ourselves and also how other people view us. So you might say, but what's the big difference between that and the one before? This one is really talking about more your adulthood, and you notice they're not really talking so much about your future. It's talking more about sort of the present and how you see yourself or what you see in the short term. Possible selves is that basically the concept that as we're young, we see that we have many different possible selves. We have a hope for ourselves and a fear for ourselves. And as we grow older, we may change some of these things. In some cases, our possible selves will decrease because we've perhaps gotten past a certain time frame where we think that's possible. So what's interesting is the younger you are, of course, the more possible selves you have. But as we get older, we tend to be more stable in what we see ourselves and how we view ourselves. The last slide that we're going to cover is something called the locus of control. They call it personal control beliefs. Basically, how much our efforts are controlled by ourselves versus things control us on the outside. Locus of controls, we like to be somewhere in the middle, where you have some belief that there are some external causes in life, but you also believe that there's some internal control you have. However, anybody who is too far on either end can suffer some psychological issues. So I'll take two students who earn a 98 on an exam. I can have the one person who has a very internal locus of control that they make everything happy. They can come up to me and go, "Oh, I am so disappointed. A 98. I can't believe I got a 98. I knew the answer to that one question. I can't believe I got it wrong. I knew it 2 minutes before I took the test. I don't know why I did that. Oh, sometimes I just wonder about myself." And of course, I look at them and say, "You got a 98. That's almost perfect. You mean you're upset you can't enjoy your 98? That's almost perfect because there was one question where you kind of flubbed a little bit, but you actually do know the answer. So technically, in a way, you could say you do have 100 because you knew what the right answer is, but you got tired. So you're not going to enjoy this A. You're not going to enjoy this good grade that you got because there's one you didn't get and you feel like you should have controlled everything. So you can see that person, they lack some joy, you might want to say. And then you can have the person who gets a 98 who comes up to me and they have sort of this belief that they don't control anything. And they'll say, oh my gosh, I got so lucky. I can't believe how lucky I got on that exam. And I'll look at them and I'll go, you got lucky getting a 98? And they go, oh God, Jess, you could have asked me this or this. Well, was either one of those things on the study guide? Well, no. I said, so you think I'd ask you something that was on the study guide? Well, I don't know, but if I didn't know about it, and I said, so you believe I would have asked you something that wasn't on the study guide? And at that point, they kind of back up a little bit. They go, well, no, I guess not. And I said, and by the way, did you come to every class? Well, of course I came to every class. That's what I should do. Did you listen to the lectures? Well, of course. Did you do the extra credits? Well, of course. How did you do in the homework? Well, I did really well. So you mean all those efforts you did, none of that contributed to basically your 98? It was just luck? They go, well, yeah. Well, you see, they can't feel like anything that they can control. They can't give themselves basically rewards for the work that they did do. So that means that everything outside of them is controlled by some mysterious force. So that's why people are sort of in the middle on this. Understand that there are some things in life we do control and there are some things in life you don't control. And it all depends on how you view it. But either end, too far, may not always be a good one. Well, chapter 10 is a little bit short, and you'll notice some of our other upcoming chapters are a little bit short. I will see you around. And remember, as normal, if you have any questions, just email me at the address below, and I'll get back to you as fast as I can.